All right, well, thank you so much, Bill, for the very kind introduction and for inviting me here. It's my first time in Monterey. Amazingly, this is the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, and I can't imagine it's taking me such a long time to get here. Sylvia and I were just interacting. She asked me if this is one of my first book talks. Indeed, it is the first book talk. So this is, and I was thinking about it after dinner with Bill last night, that it is only fitting that it should be here at the place that Bill runs, because I remember back in 2010 when I was a lowly PhD student starting out and not knowing even what my dissertation is going to be about, and somehow by chance happening on this topic of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament simply because I knew I had to write something about Ukraine on the one hand. And then in one of the classes, we read Nina Tannenwald's Nuclear Taboo. And I was like, Ukraine, nuclear, wait a minute, didn't we have some nuclear weapons? What's the story there? And Bill's paper for Stimson, Simpson Center, Politics of Nuclear Renunciation, Nuclear Disarmament, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine was literally the first paper I read on the subject. And I have to say, after nearly, well, over a decade of research, all that's in that paper stands. I see my work as simply augmenting what Bill had written back in 96. It was 96.
It came out I know it was in 95 because it was coming out at the same time as the 95 NPT
review conference. So it was very early on. So really, it was just expanding that work, and also adding more of a perspective from the standpoint of Ukraine, from the standpoint of Belarus and Kazakhstan, which was my dissertation was more equally balanced between these three cases. When I embarked on kind of publishing this dissertation as a book and doing additional research, this was post 2014. And the topic of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament became particularly relevant and pertinent. And I decided that because, as we all know, books have word limits and there's only so many words you can publish, I would rather focus these words and devote these words to Ukrainian case, which was, in any case, more complicated, more involved, and therefore more interesting. Perhaps there's more things we could learn from it. And so after this very long and tortured path, here's the book. It's out. It just came out in December. And I thought what I'll do today is I won't retell, of course, the course of Ukrainian nuclear disarmament. It's all in the book. And I hope that some of you will get it and will read it. I thought I'll focus on three main things that I took away and that from this research, and three kind of core insights that perhaps are the most relevant today. I mean, we don't really need to delve too much into why this research and why kind of knowing the history of Ukraine's nuclear disarmament is relevant today, is important, right? It relates to security of that country. There was important security decisions made in early 1990s, and today there's a war in Ukraine. You have to be either in a coma or have departed this world to Mars to not be aware about the war. And it's a very intensive war. It's a brutal war. There's a list of war crimes that has already been accrued by the Russian Federation. And I'm sad to say that there really isn't an end in sight that we could see. It's going to be a lengthy war and a lengthy process. And in particular, during this time, this nuclear history comes back to haunt, right? I can't tell you how many conversations I have had in Ukraine casually with taxi drivers and journalists and even people involved in politics, that the gist of the mood of the conversation is, yes, Ukraine had world's third largest nuclear arsenal. We gave them up for nothing under US and Russian pressure. That is the narrative. And it does translate, at least pre-war, in these tense months pre-war, it translated into this feeling of regret, right? That it was a blunder. It was a wrong decision to give up this nuclear legacy, especially, when Ukraine was finding itself in the kind of security predicament where, it was basically in a security vacuum, right? There was expanded NATO to the west, there was revisionist and belligerent Russia to the east, and Ukraine was not protected either by alliances or extended nuclear deterrence or a deterrent of its own, and it was one-on-one with a larger, more powerful, conventionally more superior opponent or an adversary. In the West, I found that much of this history has been forgotten, especially institutionally, and the institutional memory of US government is very, very short. There's a change of administration, there's a constant flux of people in and out of the administrations. And, I think in 2014, it was like, wait a minute, what did we sign back in 1994? What was that? So there was a huge education process and awareness kind of raising that had to happen post 2014 to say, yes, there is this history. And, certain things were signed. No, they weren't all that Ukrainians claim them to be. But yet they were not insignificant and they were important. In particular, this is the famous or the infamous Budapest Memorandum on security assurances to Ukraine in connection with that country's accession to the NPT, clearly as a non-nuclear weapon state. That was part of the package of agreements. It was part of the deal, part of the nuclear deal with Ukraine. And so between these two poles of Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal that it gave up for nothing, and it was a non-decision because those weren't Ukrainian weapons to give away anyways. Command control was in Moscow, and we didn't sign anything legally binding. I find that the truth is, of course, somewhere in the middle, or the truth, small t, right, as much as we can have access to it. And that history is, and that story is a lot more complicated. Right, and it's neither one of these kind of simplified narratives, as it were, simplified positions. So the bulk of the book, and I always get asked, like, so was it the right thing? Was it the right thing for Ukraine to disarm? And I've resolved I'm going to say this: take and read my book and make your own decision, right? Make your own judgment whether that was the right thing to do. Of course, I'm gonna come up front. I think it was a wise decision. It was a good decision, but yet we are still in the process of proving Ukraine right. All of us, as scholars, as decision makers, all those people that have an impact on Ukraine's fate in this day, right? It's a consequentialist argument, right? The value of that proposition is still out at large, right? We still have the power to prove Ukraine right, right? And it's going to depend how this war proceeds and what kind of role the West plays in it. So what happened in 1991, to kind of rewind now to the beginning, is something that was quite unprecedented, right? One of the nuclear superpowers, an NPT nuclear weapons state, a UN Security Council veto member, disintegrated. That created a whole ripple effect across the whole international system, not least in sort of these political, legal aspects of who are the successor states of the Soviet Union and in what respects, and in respect to which treaties and international obligations. As you can see here, I marked the strategic nuclear forces of the USSR at the moment of its disintegration. They were, oops, I was hoping to have a little red dot, but I don't. The forces were deployed, and these are both strategic missile bases and strategic bomber bases across the Soviet Union in this kind of giant arc across this huge swath of Eurasian landmass. And 3 successor republics, actually 4 successor republics, former constitutive republics of the Soviet Union, suddenly found themselves hosting shards of this enormous nuclear might. And that was, of course, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. And if you think about it this way, in that sense, all 4 of them were, in a sense, equal successor states of the Soviet Union in many, many respects. So the Soviet Union was this superstructure, right, of which the Russian Federation was clearly the biggest, clearly the most important, but only one of the constitutive republics, the Russian Social Federative whatever republic. It was a long acronym. And the succession debates right after the Soviet Union collapsed, they weren't very prominent. Nobody really contested the fact that Russia really should and would succeed the Soviet Union, say, in the UN on the on the Security Council. That was sort of commonsensical, and that was kind of accepted by all and contested by none. But some of the contestation ended up happening in Ukraine over the nuclear issue, exactly on the basis of this legal succession, in particular succession to arms control treaties. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So here I tried to map out all of Ukraine's sort of military and civilian nuclear infrastructure. 5 nuclear power plants, 1 was shut down, Chernobyl up in the north. One of the most heavily nuclearized in the civilian sense countries in the world. Close to 50% of Ukrainian energy mix still, well, before the war, still came from nuclear, which again is connected with huge amounts of spent fuel, which is always a proliferation concern. And then 2 missile divisions at, is there a pointer here at all?
It doesn't work on the screen anyway.
Oh, it doesn't. So one at Khmelnytsky, one at Khmelnytsky, sort of more in the western Ukraine. There's like a little missile, and one a little bit further south at Pervomaisk. Together, there were 176 strategic missiles with about 1,240 strategic warheads that were accounted to them. There were also spares. So these are numbers that are given by kind of start treaty accounting. When Ukraine finally did start the disarmament process, there were more missiles that were on repair. There were more spare warheads that were in storages. There was just more stuff, of course. Then all of that got dismantled, and all of the nuclear warheads got ultimately transferred to Russia. There were 2 strategic bomber bases in Priluki and Uzin. One of them, Priluki, featured the first, I suppose it's a regimental flight, I should know the military name of it, 19 Tu-160s. That was brand new aircraft back then. There were only a couple of test aircrafts in Russia, maybe at Engels Air Base back then. But the first kind of deployment of this brand new aircraft happened to Ukraine. Why? Because all this whole area to the kind of the west, abutting Europe, that was kind of the line of defense against NATO. Especially, that was sort of the second line of defense when the Warsaw Pact was still a thing. after the Soviet army and Soviet troops pulled out of Eastern Europe in 1990 and 1991, that became sort of where a lot of troops were redeployed from Eastern Europe. And in general, this was kind of the planning was for, this is where you're going to fight the bulk of war with NATO, right? So all these Western parts of the Soviet Union were very heavily militarized. Belarus was one of the highest, kind of the most militarized countries, the most militarized former Soviet republics. A ton of, many, military bases and military personnel proportionally to the country's size. And there were 4 nuclear warhead storage facilities, those secret warhead facilities that were in the custody of the 12th main directorate of the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the so-called 12th Gumo, which is the Russian abbreviation for it. That was sort of where, central storage facilities, so where the warheads from the units would be centralized and then transported by rail normally back to Russia for either maintenance or then were removed. So this is kind of Ukraine's inheritance. So what is the first takeaway that I saw or that I would like to impart or emphasize based on the research for this book? That, of course, Ukraine did not inherit a fully fledged deterrent from the Soviet Union. It was a chunk, it was a shard of a nuclear arsenal of a different country, the Soviet Union, designed for the purposes of that country. And it was not an easy thing or a straightforward thing to readjust it to Ukraine's new strategic purposes, right? Even in that sense, it was an inheritance that still would have taken a lot of work to adjust it to Ukraine's strategic aims, to these new challenges, security challenges that Ukraine faced that were now from the East, not the West, right? And they weren't in the intercontinental distances in the United States, but they were right next door. And yet, beyond the actual weaponry, Ukraine inherited also a large portion of the Soviet military-industrial complex. And even though Ukraine did lack, facilities for full fuel cycle, it had only the beginning, the mining and milling, so it would have had to invest, heavily into enrichment or reprocessing, fuel fabrication, all of that. It did have a lot of other big kind of chunks in place, including an enviable endowment in delivery vehicles manufacturing, which, you have nuclear warheads, you don't have a way to deliver them. All they are targets, right? So that's a big part of having a proper nuclear deterrent is the ability to deliver them. And of course, Ukraine was an aircraft producing state and one of 3 main Soviet missile makers was at Pivdan, but in Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, in Russian Yuzhnaya Design Bureau in Yuzhmash, in Ukrainian Pivdan and Pivdenmash. So those guys became actually the missile lobby later on in Ukraine's nuclear discourses. They had a vested interest to keep their industry alive and to keep missile manufacturing alive in some ways. Ukraine also had physics and weapons know-how, because there seems to be this kind of view that there was the Soviet Union that was normally conflated with Russia anyways throughout its history. And then somehow the earth opened up and out came the Kazakhs and the Belarusians and the Ukrainians, and they were agrarian and nomadic people. And they were like herding their flock across the Eurasian steppe or tilling the land. Not true. The Soviet Union was very much an integrated kind of project. And there were a lot of Ukrainian physicists with clearances in the Soviet nuclear program. In fact, recently I met a gentleman who was the the director or the head of the archival department at Minsedmash, the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, which was the cryptic name of Ministry for All Things Nuclear. He had access to the archives, right? And he's Ukrainian. His daughter is now working for the Ukrainian service of the Voice of America. And she called me one day and said, hey, my dad is visiting. Do you want to talk to him? He used to work, in Moscow at Minsedmash. And I talked to this guy and he said that in the early 90s, he eventually moved back to Kiev. But his pass to the ministry still worked for another 2 years because of this kind of hullabaloo and this havoc. Nobody was checking things. So he would come to see his old colleagues. He would buzz himself in or, go through the security with his old pass. He had access to this really secretive, cryptic ministry. And, he was Ukrainian ethnically and a Ukrainian patriot that then came back to Ukraine and relocated. In fact, at the time of the Soviet dissolution, the Soviet Union had 5 missile armies. One of them was headquartered in Ukraine, the Vinnytsia Missile Army. 3 of the 5 the commanders were Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainians. Moroz was up, I think, in either up in the north. I forget. The Orenburg army was headed by General Pustovy, and then the Ukrainian Vinnytsia army was headed by commanded by General Mikhtyuk. And eventually, one of the commander of the Orenburg army, General Pustovy, transferred him, resigned his position in Russia and came back to Ukraine and ended up working for Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So there was a lot of expertise, right? There was a lot of people. And what Ukraine ended up really was kind of a really handsome proliferator starter package, right? And that's how I like to say. So if there was a will to turn it into something more than that, there was certainly would have been a way on the supply side, right? Ukraine also tried to stake a claim to legal succession of the USSR. And that it was often received as kind of a bargaining ploy or whatever. But for Ukraine, and I was trying to kind of explain it in the book, it was one of the ways to redefine its relation with Moscow, to kind of contest Russian claim to the monopoly of succession to that geopolitical role that Soviet Union had once played, right? It was almost like there was these big shoes that were left from the Soviet Union, and Russia inherited those big shoes. And in a way, like Ukrainians said, just wait and see, they will start growing back into those shoes if you don't kind of truncate the shoes and resize them to Russia's size today. So I'm sure there's a lot of people in Ukraine from back that time who are saying, I told you so. So that was part of the contestation in the nuclear realm, that they said, all right, there were several successor states to the Soviet Union. And in the nuclear realm, there's at least 4, including us and the Belarusians and Kazakhstanis. You have to treat us equitably under the NPT. Not under negotiations of START, for instance, the implementation of START and other arms control treaties. What made it really difficult to sustain that claim to legitimate legal succession, was the very existence of the NPT. And that was sort of my, this theoretical argument I could make, that the NPT turned out to be monumentally important and that historical moment, because it made sure that the nuclear part of that Soviet inheritance fell under a different set of rules than the conventional part. Because in a way, nobody contested the fact that Ukraine inherited X number of tanks and aircraft and whatever. It was proportionally, the reductions in accordance with the conventional forces in Europe treaty were just conventional, proportionally kind of calculated for each one of the successor states. You had to reduce those forces accordingly. And yet a different set of rules applied to the nuclear part of inheritance. It immediately became an international issue, so not something to negotiate between successors and, haggle over like whose tank is this and whose aircraft is that. I was there just for repair, please return it back. It became immediately an issue of very high international importance. So that's sort of one of the things that Ukraine did have options and did have agency, and it did negotiate, and it negotiated hard and got something out of it. So it wasn't just like Ukraine had no options. By making the right decision doesn't mean that there weren't bad and poor decisions that Ukraine could nevertheless have chosen to follow. So in the deliberations, there were both things that weighed in favor of nuclear retaining some of this technology, even nuclear weapons potentially, and there were factors that weighed in favor of disarmament. And those were, so when you look at the archival documents, the very nature of nuclear decision-making was to deliberate these options. So when we are looking for like, what are the drivers of nuclear proliferation or nuclear disarmament, there isn't one. And it's a very unsatisfactory answer for political scientists that want to isolate those drivers and want to kind of make it, one or two really, explanatory drivers. Well, oftentimes there isn't just one. Life is complicated. Politics are complicated. And at least in Ukraine, the very nature of nuclear decision-making was to look at the whole breadth of different things and consequences, the costs and consequences of going with the options, considering the options were, three options were considered. One was to retain nuclear weapons and, calculate what it would take to turn that inheritance into a proper nuclear deterrent. Then the second option was, of course, to join the NPT and kind of disarm in exchange for compensation and security, guarantees, as Ukrainian put it. And the third option was to retain the strategic carriers, the strategic launchers, and kind of retrofit them with conventional, so sort of preemptive, or the precursor to prompt global strike or something like that. And that was the option that was really pushed by the missile lobby that who wanted to retain their missiles, but had nothing really, no bone to pick with the nuclear part of it. So they weren't pushing for the nuclear thing. But of course, for Ukrainian strategic, ICBMs were really not the right weapon, although clearly they were looking at different ranges. And in that, so that's this last point on the favors. It's a really interesting case because, the ranges that would have been quote unquote useful, even for conventional, that kind of strategic conventional deterrent, were then prohibited by INF. So that's an unsung role of the INF in this whole story, is that eventually Ukrainian decision makers, one of the diplomats said, we were like, there was this whole contestation about START, do we ratify it, not ratify it in the Ukrainian parliament? And he's like, we were barking at the wrong treaty. Ultimately, it was the INF that prohibited the ranges from 500 to 5,500 kilometers that would have been useful if Ukraine wanted to hold Russian assets and Russian targets at risk. Of course, in some kind of perverse way, the very kind of singular focus of U.S. decision of Washington back at that time on the nuclear issue, because that became the issue Ukraine would be approached on, right? There's this country, you didn't know it even existed, 2 weeks ago, and suddenly there's all these delegations rolling into Kiev and into Minsk and into Almaty, and they're all asking about nuclear weapons. And again, it's commanding the attention of the powerful states and the powerful people in Washington, where it wouldn't have gone before. So eventually this kind of overwhelming attention to the nuclear issue eluded Ukrainians too, like, hey, if these guys think it's so important, that's because it's probably important. So let's see, how it could be important to us. And there was a real fear that once Ukraine disarms, that attention is going to wane. And they weren't wrong eventually, as it turns out. Other things, of course, the primary was security concern. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia has started deteriorating pretty much right away. There was kind of conflagrations over the division of the Black Sea Fleet and the status of Crimea and so forth. On the kind of in favor of disarmament part, there was, of course, the lingering so-called Chernobyl syndrome. And that helped kind of shape the nuclear discourse in Ukraine right away from the get-go with a sort of self-proclaimed nuclear renunciation back in 1990. There were the Ukrainian parliament adopted the Declaration of State Sovereignty in 1990 through this parade of sovereignties, and wrote into it, basically put in a clause that Ukraine eventually will become a non-nuclear state. And part of that, the reason for that article, for that clause, was of course the trauma of Chernobyl and the negative kind of sentiment towards all things nuclear. Ukraine would have needed to invest heavily into fuel cycle, into all of these facilities, and also to defy the probably international isolation and even if sanctions, although or at least withholding of Western assistance. At that point, sanctions could have probably achieved a limited thing because Ukraine was already isolated as kind of this chunk of the Soviet Union. There wasn't much interaction with the West that you could hold as kind of leverage over Ukraine. But certainly Ukraine needed a lot of funds from the IMF, from the World Bank to stabilize its currency, to come out of this really dire post-Soviet transitional crisis. And it couldn't have done that had it decided to go the nuclear route or continued to protract the process, continued bargaining, negotiating over it. Of course, it also found itself across the negotiating table with two nuclear superpowers, right? Two very powerful states. And even though Russia was not, US was enjoying its unilateral moment, and even though Russia was still, quite weakened and not the Russia we know today, it had a huge leverage in terms of fuel supply to Ukraine. There were huge debts accrued by Ukraine and some very, with the help of some very corrupt Ukrainian officials that then became oligarchs. So there's kind of that story, and that's for a separate book. But I also found that it was very difficult for Ukraine's political leaders, certainly not the military folk, but for Ukraine political leaders, President Kravchuk and diplomats, it was very difficult for them to grasp what deterrence is all about. When they thought of nuclear weapons, they thought of having to launch them, of pressing that button. And when they thought that they would be in the position of authority or, have to make such a decision, they balked at the idea. And a part of me wonders, which one is more insane? They are probably the saner people to think if the push comes to shove and I have to press that button, will I really press it? And the answer was no. Certainly not coming in the country, with Chernobyl and seeing what, a nuclear reactor core meltdown could do. So they whatever claims they could make to that weren't really credible to themselves, first and foremost. And therefore, it was hard to convince others. And I think very, very importantly, and also connected to the NPT and the membership in the NPT, was the desire to join the international community as a good citizen. That for a new country that's emerging out of this totalitarian empire and kind of recast itself as an aspiring democracy, to get under sanctions and international opprobrium would have been disastrous. And it's not only because of the things Ukraine wouldn't get in that case. It was also because of the country Ukraine wanted to be. It was very much an identity-based thing, right? It wanted to join the international community on good terms. And so in 1994, it basically signs away, joins the NPT. Another thing that I touched, and I'm going to breeze through it because I'm already, as I suspect, I'm talking too long. Another takeaway is that when Ukraine deliberated these choices and deliberated in a context of the world that already had a certain order, and the non-proliferation regime was part and parcel of that greater order, right? It was not anarchy. It wasn't a free-for-all, right? Ukraine was entering a certain world structured in a certain way. There were 5 boxes at the UN Security Council. There were 5 boxes under the NPT for nuclear weapon states. One of them kind of ceased to exist as a state, but there could be only one that could succeed it, right? You could not multilateralize that box, as it were, because it would be order changing. And Ukraine could not, as the deputy foreign minister who Boris Tarasyuk, who was in charge of negotiating the nuclear deal, he said, for Ukraine to retain nuclear weapons would be to go against the entire world order. That, at least that was the perception, that Ukraine would be defying the world as it stood at that point, these kind of normative and institutional frameworks. As I said, the international non-proliferation regime, as part of it, basically ensured that the nuclear part of inheritance fell under a different set of rules than everything else. The very existence of that treaty, beyond everything else. It also provided what I called nuclear grammar. It was categories and definition, defined what makes a nuclear weapon state. It provided only 2 categories of states, right? So non-nuclear weapon states is a huge category that includes both very capable states, for instance, that are capable of developing nuclear weapons or have nuclear civilian nuclear facilities, have enrichment facilities, and places that will never have it, right? So like all of that falls into that category. And Ukraine had to choose between just those 2. It couldn't create any new ones, right? That it felt were more appropriate to it. So it sort of delineated Ukrainian the options for Ukraine at that time. And of course, the arms control architecture too was, as we discussed, was very important and was one of the sites in which this succession issue got deliberated and negotiated. So takeaway 3, and that has to do more specifically with the Budapest Memorandum and some of the bad press that it's getting today, or at least post 2014. Deals are what you make of it. International deals are really what you make of it. Ukraine did negotiate hard, and it did achieve a deal, which under the circumstances, I think was already a pretty amazing feat. When a country with so little leverage, amid this crisis, its diplomats having their allowances of like some pitiful, pennies showing up in Geneva and in DC, and not even being able to take anyone out for a coffee, I mean, just the asymmetry of capabilities between a state capability, between the states involved was really amazing. And yet Ukrainians did negotiate, and they did achieve a deal. They got compensation for the fissile material contained in nuclear weapons. They got security commitments from the NPT nuclear state. Budapest Memorandum was signed by the NPT depository states. France and China pledged unilaterally similar, mostly negative and positive NPT related nuclear security assurances. And it wasn't nothing. Ukraine, and by extension Belarus and Kazakhstan, that also got similar memoranda, they're pretty much the only countries that joined the NPT with such a addendum, with such a document in tow, and it's registered at the UN. It's part of the whole of a broader non-proliferation regime. It was neither a panacea as Ukrainians thought. I think there was a great sense of complacency when Ukraine, signed something with President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain and the Russians, and they signed it and they shelved it, and they were like, we got security guarantees. Well, not not even, I would say, not even U.S. treaty allies could rest on such, sort of laurels and sit back and do nothing and not redevelop that relationship, not build up that security relationship. And that is one of the things that Ukraine did poorly in the 30 years or in the 25 years before the Budapest Memorandum was breached. Now, I would argue that after 2014, it was the other signatories, the United States and the UK, that made very little of the memorandum. Again, they could have chosen to front it, to sort of emphasize that agreement. And even the security and defense assistance that they were providing Ukraine could have been billed as part of, kind of delivering on those commitments, which I think would have done nothing bad, only probably bolstered the non-proliferation regime. And, at the end of the day, it could be legally binding. It could be, it could be something like the UN Charter. And a great power state can still breach it, and there's still very little we can do about it, right? The Geneva UN Charter, is it legally binding? Last time I checked, it was. Does it prohibit aggressive war and invasion? Yes, it does. Did Russia abide by it? No, it didn't. So the consequences for the non-proliferation regime, of course, are not good. The credibility of negative security assurances is damaged. What do we make of a responsible nuclear weapon state? That's up in the air. And of course, the argument that I'm trying to make is that because Budapest Memorandum is kind of part of this larger system, if you pull it one side of that fabric, the ripples will go across the whole system. But it also, in other indirect ways, now, Article 6, nuclear states have already been under fire for doing too little on it. And now the prospects of arms control are even dimmer because there's war in Ukraine, because the two countries are barely on speaking terms. Also, the efforts to sort of diminish the role of nuclear weapons in the world and in the defense and doctrines of states will have to wait because likely the demand for deterrence and demand for extended deterrence by the allies will go up. Simply because it seems that the war in Europe erupted exactly in the area that was not covered by nuclear deterrence, right? In that vacuum. And that's likely going to be the conclusions that these states will make. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Sorry for going on too long. And I'm happy to talk about not just the book, but also my experiences in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Mariana. This was really fascinating for me. It was pushing all kinds of buttons and reminding me of my own interviews.
I'm triggering you.
Yeah, really. And I have to restrain myself in terms of the comments and questions that I make. Let me raise just a few issues, and then we have a good 50 minutes for Q&A. And Abner looks like he has his arm poised, and we'll give everybody a chance to speak who wishes to. I think one point, and I should mention, and I should have said this in the introduction. We had a chance to spend a number of days together in Siena, which was a fascinating meeting that was part of Tom Blanton's kind of efforts and Svetlana's efforts to bring together individuals who were actually engaged on the American, Russian, and Ukrainian side to look at the kind of oral history of nuclear decision-making. And I think and it's relevant to one of the points that I want to make, which you've also kind of alluded to, is the danger of trying to reach judgments today without recognizing what the world looked like back in the early 90s. And I think one advantage that I had when I was doing my research was it was kind of more contemporary. It was a contemporaneous kind of process. I was talking to policymakers who were grappling with these issues. And the world looked very, very different at that time. I mean, the United States and Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, had worked very closely on non-proliferation issues for many, many years, particularly in the NPT context. So it's very different than the situation today. At this conference in Siena, it was fascinating for me to see the manner in which Russian and Ukrainian generals interacted. I mean, they were all part of the same complex. And I remember vividly, I was seated next, I can't remember who I was seated next to, maybe it was with Tom and Svetlana. But in any case, I was talking with folks and I said, just wait. General Moslin, who was there, is going to start to sing, and then everybody will be singing together, all the Ukrainian and Russian generals and others. And sure enough, by the end of the final dinner, Moslin was
singing along with them.
So the world looks very different today than it did in the past. And related also to that point, I remember I had the opportunity to travel, I want to say in 1992, to Ukraine at one of the first conferences dealing with non-proliferation. But I was there also because the center was trying to develop relationships with the nuclear safety regulatory bodies in all of the post-Soviet states. And I remember vividly going to meet with Nikolai Steinberg, who was the head of GANU, which was the nuclear safety regulatory body, and his colleague, whose name I'm blocking out now, Andrei Glukov, who was his colleague. And it was a very interesting conversation. We wanted to help them, but because of the tracking that we had been doing on nuclear assets, and I had actually commissioned a study for people at the Kurchatov Institute, I had more information about Ukrainian nuclear assets, particularly in the dual use sector, than did the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So one of the things we were doing was to provide him with information. So again, retrospectively, we may know all of these things, but at the time, it was something that was not well known because much of the expertise, much of the knowledge of the nuclear industry, it's not just in Ukraine, but in Belarus and particularly in Kazakhstan, resided in Moscow. They didn't, I mean, the Kazakhs didn't know about the plutonium, stocks that were buried in Semipalatinsk. And by the same token, many of the Ukrainians didn't know all of the assets that they had. So I think that's one point that's important. And maybe the other point that I'll make here, and then turn it over, and I'm interested in Mariana's comments as well. I think this is identified in your takeaways, but I think it merits perhaps more discussion. If you ask, what was the major challenge, the major security threat faced by Ukraine at the time, not today, but at the time, I would argue it was the economic situation. It was a domestic problem for which nuclear weapons were absolutely irrelevant. And if anything, they were a drain. They would not have assisted in dealing with the most pressing issues at the time. And so it's fine today to talk about, wouldn't it be nice perhaps as a deterrent to have had these weapons? But at the time, the world looked very, very different. There were all kinds of questions about the future of Ukraine in the early 90s. People didn't know how this would play out, that you would in fact have an independent Ukraine in 2023. So I think those are some issues that merit further discussion. But thanks so much, Mariana. It was really a brilliant presentation.
Well, thank you. And it means a lot coming from you, since you sort of pioneered this area of study. I think you were absolutely right, that Ukrainians, so there was quite a bit of expertise, but that expertise was not central. It was not part of kind of a central state governed project. And, Ukraine's first president, Kravchuk, and foreign minister Zlenko, Anatoly Zlenko, in his memoirs, remembers in one of the first meetings with the Americans who came in asking about nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear forces, they said they could only basically take notes. They didn't have answers. They had to go back and, pull their military people and pull. All of this is also happening on the background of the kind of parceling out of the centralized Soviet armed forces along the national borders. There are loyalty issues. There's oath that needs to be administered. For most of Ukrainian conventional military, this nuclear issue is a bother. It's actually a thorn in their side, because it's one of the ways that until you make a decision, until you can completely sever it from Moscow, it's one of the ways in which Moscow's influence still trickles into Ukrainian military affairs, right? So Ukraine's first defense minister, Morozov, Konstantin Morozov, he was very pro disarmament, because he had his hands full with conventional military that was unwieldy. There were 1 million men under arms in Ukraine in 1991, 1 million. 750 of that was regular deployments to Ukraine, again, because it was going to be that front line for taking on NATO. The rest of it seems to be the troops redeployed from Eastern Europe that were bivouacked in Ukraine and Belarus and other places. So you had to feed them, you had to give them housing, you had to dismiss some of them, you had to retire some of them, you had to swap people, that Russian citizens that wanted to go back to Russia, and then repatriate Ukrainians who wanted to return home. There was a whole lot of things that Ukrainian military was dealing with. So you're absolutely right that we have to look at this now, still preserving kind of that contemporaneous landscape, as it were, and also realize, and it's always a point that late Ash Carter used to make about this topic, was that we assumed that Ukraine would have been still the same country today, only with nuclear weapons. Had it made a different decision in 1994? No, Ukraine would have been a different country with nuclear weapons today than it is now, for better or worse, but it would have been a completely different country.
Thanks so much, Mariana. After I saw your hand.
Yeah. Number of reflections about the Budapest Memorandum, including to what extent that memorandum is being perceived today in Ukraine. And obviously you can think about it politically or legally, and to what extent it's being viewed as a material breach in terms of the promises of what the West was giving Ukraine. And then if the wording would have been different, the wording would have been not assurances, but rather guarantees, or some stronger word rather than that kind of rather weak memorandum. To what extent, in retrospect, do you think it would make a difference? And then there is the question, I mean, you say Ukraine would be a different country had it kept the nuclear weapon, which is also a question, what does it mean to keep the nuclear weapons? To build the command and control, it's very complex. It would move the country, it would create from the very beginning tensions with Russia, because it would be almost divided. I mean, could you think about any concept? I mean, it was not primarily tactical nuclear weapons. Could you think about the way that Ukraine would ever consider using nuclear weapons against Russia? I mean, it's so. What's the attitude today when you think about that kind of questions?
So in Ukraine, the attitude is pretty much here, right? So this is a poster. One was spotted on the Maidan, Ukraine's Kyiv Central Square, in 2017, and it's 3 rolls of toilet paper. Russia basically besmirched it, and the other ones are just, still on the toilet, on the roll of toilet paper. I have been trying to argue as much as I could that this does very little service to Ukrainians, first and foremost, that it is a political document. It doesn't matter what you actually call, whether it's assurances or guarantees. The whole issue back then was that, the US was not going to take any new security commitments in regard to Ukraine beyond what has already been, what's already out there, whether under, UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the negative and positive nuclear-related security assurances. So, clearly, it wasn't going to get anything like Article 5 or Mutual Defense Treaty or anything like that. Not in 94, not, it's inconceivable. So for Ukrainians, it was a difference between getting nothing at all and getting at least something in writing. And therefore, I'm saying this is an achievement. Be proud of it and use it diplomatically to your advantage. The people who negotiated, signed it, have argued that this was more conceived in the sense of being kind of a framework for further than cooperation and the defense. Perhaps it could have been leveraged a lot better in the.
In other words, you're saying that it still play a role in terms of the commitment of the UK and the US to the war in Ukraine. It plays some role in giving Ukraine's.
No, that was my criticism of the US and UK, that whatever defense aid that they did provide and defense assistance back after 2014 could have been couched in those terms. It wouldn't have done anything. And I remember asking and kind of senior NATO officials at the time saying, well, why aren't you guys doing it that way? And that person said, well, we'll look at these as two separate issues. I did not pry, but I think that was a mistake. So it sidelined this agreement altogether. There was a consultation of the signatories that was convened at Ukraine's request, and the kind of provision for consultations is written into the memorandum. Should issues arrive in connection with blah blah, Ukraine convened the meeting of signatories on March 5th, 2014. They published a statement condemning Russia, saying which was important, and that was it. Beyond that, whether, again, that institutional memory was lost on both sides, whether Ukrainians dismissed it right away prematurely instead of using it as a diplomatic tool to get, for instance, get the United States and the UK engaged into what became the Normandy process. Why not? Why not the Budapest Memorandum signatories? Why France and Germany? I mean, again, it could have still ended up being just France and Germany because of the leading from behind of an Obama foreign policy that wanted to kind of push the European allies to kind of sort out their own problems in their own backyard. But it could have been a powerful argument that at least Ukraine should have made it. Instead, the document was sidelined entirely. In terms of how Ukraine could have used nuclear weapons. So again, it's a lot of kind of what ifs and counterfactuals. On some very broad level, the nuclear technology is a technology of 1940s. If Pakistan and North Korea could have cobbled together a nuclear deterrent, so certainly eventually could have Ukraine, right? The question was at what cost, right? And the cost really outweighed the benefits of it. Now, the next question is, even if they could cobble together something, eventually it didn't have to be by 94, it didn't have to be even, but some kind of, they say they don't join the NPT and just kind of keep things ambiguous and dabble. Can you get the kind of deterrent that could credibly deter a nuclear force like Russia's, the largest in the world? That's also kind of a question. So I think for Ukraine, kind of the hedging option would have probably been strategically the most useful, but again, politically, especially internationally, most costly. So, why does France have nuclear weapons? Why does UK have the, little Poland? How are they going to use these nuclear weapons? It's the same questions that could be asked of many nuclear possessing states. And one has to assume that if nuclear deterrence somehow works for France, might have also worked for Ukraine, right? In the same way. But Ukraine did say we could be, France of Eastern Europe, like that comparison with France was put forward, was mentioned a couple of times. But again, these are questions about counterfactuals at this point. And
Thank you. I mean, it was very, I mean, on the French-Ukrainian connection, I do remember when I wrote this thing a long time ago, I was really struck, particularly by, I think, General Talupko, who was enamored by General Gaulois of the French, and was employing some of the same, I mean, I don't know if it became a bestseller in Ukraine at the time, but there was this tendency to look to the force de frappe as a possible model. But John, you have your hand up.
Thank you. Mariana, great presentation. Thank you very much. You mentioned in your opinion that in 2014 that the US and the UK did not push back with the Russian invaded Crimea and did not abide by the undertakings under the Budapest Agreement. Given what we know today, what should they have done? What could they have done to change this?
So I think, the reaction probably should have been a lot more severe. The fact that Crimea was taken without fighting, right, kind of made it look like a benign takeover, right? There was no blood spilled. And somehow in much of the imagery, which really quite strikes me, Crimea ended up being a different thing and a separate thing than the Donbass. And that separation was really very unhelpful. Like both are part of international recognized Ukrainian territory, and it doesn't matter. But there was kind of this allowance that, oh yes, but Crimea is important to Russia for historical reasons, and oh yes, there's a large Russian population there, ethnic Russian population, and oh yes, that's a basis of Russian. So there was, even though it wasn't a justification, there was kind of a way to understand it. Another thing that could have been done. So, certainly more robust sanctions could have been imposed. In retrospect, military assistance. I mean, U.S. Congress, in a bipartisan way, approved the supply of javelins. I think it was already 2015. In 2015, and the Obama administration, when the war was still fighting, they could have come in very useful. And the Obama administration did not supply those. They were not released to Ukraine, the anti-tank, weapons, javelins, until the Trump administration. That was not certainly due to Trump, probably despite of him, but, there was, the package was ready, and there were, the administration was able to get it through. Another thing is diplomatically, US and UK should have been involved in the negotiations of the ceasefire and the settlement of that conflict in the East. They should have been there at the table. They should have not relinquished that to Germany and France, and Germany, who signed the Nord Stream 2 deal with the Russians for the building of the pipeline after the annexation. In 2014, they signed that gas deal with Russians and proceeded putting billions into that project. So, talk about a little bit of a conflict of interest. So they could have been more proactive in that sense.
What's also interesting, I mean, on that point, and I see Glenn Schweitzer who has his hand up, and we'll call upon Glenn in just a moment. But I was struck in the years since 2014 how infrequently the issue of the Budapest Memorandum was raised in the NPT context. This was not an issue on which the US was particularly active in making the case, or many of its allies. So that's another forum where one might have expected more to have been done. So Glenn, for some of you who don't know, Glenn was the first director of the ISTC in Moscow. We had the pleasure of traveling together on various US-Russian Academy of Sciences meetings. And so Glenn, it's always great to see you. Please, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thanks, Bill.
Can you speak up, or let me, 1 second. We have one now? Okay, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Bill. First, let me congratulate the presenter. I thought it was an excellent overview of what happened in those days. I was deeply involved in the response to Chernobyl. I was there within 3 months leading an American environmental group. But then, more to your point, or not unrelated, when I was the head of the ISTC in 92 to 94, or I was waiting to become the head of the ISTC, which was then established in 94, Ukraine was an interesting case. All of the ISTC was set up to fund the conversion of weapons scientists to civilian tasks. And
This is the International Science and Technology Center, for those of you who haven't followed ISDC.
And eventually $1 billion went through that organization. When I was there, it was only 65 billion. But as we discussed the membership, it was originally Japan, United States, and the European Union, and of course, Russia. And then the issue of Ukraine came up. And shouldn't Ukraine be somehow involved? And the idea was, well, if we want to convert weapons scientists to civilian scientists, there are a lot of them there, and they certainly need the money. But then, for some reason, we couldn't understand. The Ukrainians said, "We don't want anything to do with you. We want our own center." And we were pretty good bureaucrats. We were disappointed. One of our principal clients was Bailey. And I couldn't understand why. And the United States, Canada were the only countries who supported the idea of having a separate center for Ukraine. And that's what really happened. And so you had the Science and Technology Center of Ukraine. And it turns out that even today, that center is a really valuable asset in addressing what's going on in Ukraine. But I think that of course, as Bill said, we thought a lot differently then than we do today. But I just want to put that piece of information in the pot. I don't know if you can use it or not, but it certainly made an impression on me of the unwillingness of the Ukrainian people, despite the poverty was everywhere, to not go along with the Russians was really crystal clear. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Glenn. All right, it was, I think, an observation, but if you wanted to comment at all.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn, so much. And you're right. There was, I'm still to get to the bottom of it. What you talk about in terms of kind of weapons scientists is also somehow true for the military folk, which I found astonishing, given just how centralized and homogenizing the Soviet military had been. Like this is where the Soviet man got made, right? Russified, made, stripped of culture, and ethnic background. And yet these internal ethnic markers and divisions, they still remained. One of the generals I interviewed told me, that is a strategic missile forces general, told me that he was, he was going up the ladder. He was in the strategic forces, and then at some point in mid-80s, General Agarkov, he was the chief of general staff, conducted a survey of the ethnic background of the officer corps of the Soviet army. And it came back with a disproportionate Ukrainian officer kind of representation. And he was horrified. So this general, without knowing what happened, got held down for promotion and sent to like the academy of this. Again, he was going to be commander of the division, and suddenly he didn't get it. And finally, at some point, he was baffled and really disappointed. And at some point, one of the military HR came into whatever unit, and they ended up having some vodka in the banya, which is where a lot of business gets done in that part of the world. And the HR person, and he was kind of pouring out his disappointment. The HR person kind of looked at him and said, "Are you stupid? You don't understand what's happening? You're a chachol," which is the Russian kind of a bit of a derogatory word for a Ukrainian. And he said, "Oh, that's so." Even that, like, he was marked for being Ukrainian and not promoted because somehow they were overrepresented. I was also told that specifically within the strategic missile forces, there were these unwritten rules about who should not make it into officer corps. There were specific ethnicities that were barred. The three Baltic people, for being unreliable. So you did not let them anywhere near nuclear weapons. 3 Baltic people, Chechen, Ingush, Jews. And I think maybe there's 7 I think that were, and I have the list somewhere, and those were unwritten rules. You won't find it anywhere, but the military folks said we all knew that was the case, and so the officer corps in the strategic rocket forces was overwhelmingly Slavic, which is where Kazakhstan found itself with its military bases. Our colleague Tagjan Kasanova, who wrote this excellent book about Kazakhstan's nuclear program, she recorded that she was told that the Kazakh officers in the missile forces, you could count them on one hand. So all of these things somehow still persisted. And if I survive to write another book after the PTSD of this one, I really do want to explore these ethnic relations within the Soviet military. I think that's an unexplored area, and also might explain why the Soviet military dissolution really kind of happened in a rather peaceable way. Amazingly, if you have this amazingly huge military force that was all going to be, loyal to Moscow, and you have that falling apart. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, right? It could have led to all sorts of unsavory things and wars and unauthorized use of force. And fortunately, that was avoided. So I'm wondering if that could be part of it. But thank you for your comment, Glenn.
Maybe I'll call on other parties, but I also want to give you the opportunity, since we have about 20 minutes left, if you want to share any observations about your recent travel to Ukraine. I think it would be a good time to do so, because it's something that a few of us have the opportunity to kind of glean those firsthand observations, particularly someone as knowledgeable as you, Mariana. So I want to encourage you to say something. Caitlin, did you have a question?
Sophia from our DC office.
Oh, okay, Sophia.
Yeah, let's take
Please
that.
go ahead, Sophia. Can we get, okay.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you so much for this talk. Has been so interesting and so wonderful to listen to. I have a question, drawing back to your points, talking about how international treaties are what you make of them, and Ukraine got the Budapest Memorandum and then kind of put it on a shelf. So I'm really wondering about this period between 1994 and 2014. In that time span, were there opportunities from your research that you're seeing to make more of the Budapest Memorandum? Were there conversations going on about maybe how to leverage this, how to continue forward this conversation on security assurances and guarantees that maybe didn't move forward? I'm curious if you came across any of that during your research for this.
So thank you so much, Sophia. I didn't research or delve much into the period post 1994, between 1994 and 2014, but anecdotally, I think very much so. Yes, there could have been more that Ukraine should have and could have done more with that document in terms of building, the kind of security cooperation maybe with the West that did not have to be formalistic, right? I think Ukraine really kind of honed in on this NATO membership as a idea fix, right? And I thought, like, if we just sign something, and I wonder if it's kind of leftover from the Soviet kind of perception of things. It's a very formalistic way of thinking. Like, if you have a piece of paper and you signed it, and that kind of makes you into someone important. Whereas, again, special international relations, you really have to work on it. And my argument has always been to Ukrainians, look what Israel is doing day in and day out. Does it have a mutual defense treaty with the United States? It's a non-major, non-NATO ally, like a bunch of, but it really works at its security every single day. No single piece of paper will secure that state, right? It has to be present in the United States and in Washington, and it does build its own security every single day in a very dangerous neighborhood. So that was kind of, I think, clearly Ukraine in that time had a lot of internal turbulence, and I think it was trying to kind of deliberate and decide who it wants to be as a state with these consecutive revolutions, and and the direction clearly was taken towards the European integratory project, something that clearly Russia didn't quite like, but also at the expense of security, hard security, plain and simple. Where is that Soviet legacy military industrial, capabilities? Ukraine exported, I think, and produced tanks. Ukraine built aircraft, used to. There is a missile building bureau in Kiev, Luch. There's, the parts of space craft are produced in Ukraine. Like, why is that not leveraged towards Ukraine defense demands and requirements? Why are we going around right now with a stretched out hand begging for missile systems or for air defense systems? Right. So that was, I think, a missed opportunity. But again, it's always smart to say that in retrospect, because I can imagine that under Ukrainian economic, conditions, if a president came in and said, "Oh, we're going to take this chunk of budget and throw it at defense," there would have been an uproar saying like, "Oh, we need roads, we need, infrastructure, we need these other things. Why are we spending money on weapons?" So,
thank you, Mariana. Let me perhaps ask you to share with us maybe two, usually takeaways. So I know there are lots of takeaways from your recent trip, but I know from our conversation last night, you had some very intriguing encounters while you were in Kiev, and also just getting there. Perhaps you could share, a couple of those with us, and that might generate some other questions. But I think it really is an interesting. It has interesting insights into the contemporary situation in Ukraine. So if you wouldn't mind departing from the discussion of the book.
I do. So I'll preempt it by saying that I did write down my impressions in this kind of, it reads like something out of magical realism stories. It's really quite surreal. And I think, and I'm not sure if it's surreal for me because I'm sort of like inside and outside, I kind of straddle these two worlds of Ukraine and, and here, I went back. So anyway, so I recorded in this kind of travelogue my impressions, and I am in the process of, hopefully they might be published even this week online. So I won't name the publisher, but you will, for those who follow me on Twitter, I will post it and you can read about it in more detail. So one of the things that was striking to me is just how normal things are. There's this sense of normalcy in a country that's at war. And yet there's these absolutely extraordinary things that happen in a way casually. And it's this mesh of mundane and extraordinary, of kind of peace and war, of flat white sipped at cafes and air raid sirens, right? That is a really surreal experience that I'm still reeling from. And my mom still lives in Ukraine. She's in Western Ukraine in Lviv. So I have not been back since early February, second week of February. I flew in February because my mom was undergoing like a small surgical procedure and it wasn't a planned trip, but I flew in as US was releasing all this intelligence about the imminence of Russian invasion and evacuating his diplomatic staff. I was flying into Lviv. And then, I left and a week later, the war started. So I thought I really should go back and for the holidays, for New Year's and the old calendar Christmas, because Ukrainians still celebrate the old calendar. And I don't say Orthodox because where I am, they're Union Catholics, but they're still on the old calendar. So just getting there was was an odyssey, was an adventure because nothing flies into Ukraine. So the closest you can get is someplace in Poland, and then it's trains and automobiles and all these things. But literally the day before I was due to leave, I get a text from a friend in DC who says, oh, I was just in contact with the other common friend who's in London. All of us are from Lviv. We're like sort of this mafia that's scattered around the world. And she said, this friend, Alina, her brother is at Bakhmut, which is where some of the fiercest fighting is happening right now. He volunteered, he's an architect, really good one. And he's out there at Bakhmut and he needs warm clothes. It's been mild, they're like knee deep in mud in the trenches, but could you see if you can, she sends me some links from, I think British, because she's British Army stock, and I'm leaving the next day, so I don't have time to order online. So I live in Maine, I drive to Salem, New Hampshire, to an Army surplus store. And I show up there, I don't know what I'm even looking at, and there's like a bunch of these bearded tattooed guys, and I'm like, where's the warm stuff? So they bring me to a rack and I find, and she's like, it's medium, right, whatever. I find the size, and then I'm looking at this rack and I'm looking at this like warm US Air Force, I think was a really kind of extreme cold weather gear, right? It's marked. I'm like, I think this is it. And I'm like, how, I can't just get one. Like, how do I get just this one set for this one soldier, right? Like, it's ridiculous. So I grab the rack, there's liners, there's like German army mittens, there's thermal underwear. I clean out the store. I come out and that's the morning of my departure. I'm leaving at 9 o'clock in the morning. This is the morning up. So I have a car full of all this cold weather gear. I go by Dick's, I get this enormous hockey bag, right? I don't even have, so I stuff the thing, and then I have my one suitcase and a little carry-on and a computer bag. So I'm like this bag woman. I arrive in Warsaw, and a friend was going to drive me to the border, but then she couldn't for a variety of good reasons. So now I'm like with these bags, what do I do? So the friend in DC, again, like this is how this whole war happens, or how the whole society works. So I'm like, Ola, I don't know how to get it. She's like, don't worry, I know a guy in Warsaw. He used to be with the Freedom House. He knows Ukraine. He'll help you. Within a minute, this guy comes up online and says, I got your ticket to Przemysl, which is a town in Poland very close to the border. You can, get a taxi to the border. It's 10 minutes, and then you walk the border. It's the fastest way. And, so like within minutes, I had a ticket, train ticket in Poland, right? The next morning, he comes in, loads me in his car, takes me to the train station, loads everything on the train. I get to Krakow. I change trains, I get to Przemysl, and all of that, like taking those bags off and on the train. I get in the taxi, 10 minutes, I'm at the border. At this point, it's like 7 o'clock at night. I got these, like all these bags, and I just pushed I don't know how I did it. I just kind of loaded myself with bags and just pushed forward like this train. And I catch myself, so there's a Polish border control, and then there's a Ukrainian border control, and I'm walking slowly, this paved walk, there's nobody there, paved walkway, and I realized that at one point, I must have crossed that border, that imaginary point. I stepped from Poland into Ukraine, from NATO to non-NATO, from basically a country at peace to a country at war. Like all it took was this one step from one paper to the next. So long story short, I get home, all is good. The girlfriend of the soldier at Bakhmut comes in, takes everything, the loot for him and his unit, whatever. They're like, oh, this stuff is great. Well, I'm like, how are you even sending it to like the front line? She's like, Nova Poshta. It's a Ukrainian private mailing company, really successful, and they still work. They basically deliver it to the unit, to the front line. She's like, yeah, no, not a problem. And she's kind of this babbly. She's like, I didn't hear from him the last couple of days because he's at position 0. And position 0 is that no man's land between the two fortified lines of it. This is where a lot of the killing takes place, and it's you hear that it's like littered with Russian dead because they don't remove them, and it's so then I'm there and I'm thinking, I'm trying not to think about it because I think like, what if this bag gets there and he's no longer there to wear the stuff? He's at position 0, like he's out in the most dangerous probably spot in the world right now at Bakhmut. So, since they handed off the stuff in the bag, 7 days pass and it's Christmas Day, January 7th. And I wake up to find in my phone on WhatsApp a message from Alina in London, his sister, and it contains a video. It contains a video recorded by this young man who came out of position 0. And he's there in his fatigues and he's got the rifle kind of pointing down, and he recorded a thank you message. He recorded a thank you message to me, and also there's this diaspora family, Ukrainian family, that contributed to the bill. So it was around $1,000 that I spent at that army surplus store. And again, this friend Oля, who's kind of this great cardinal behind the scenes, she's like, I got some money for you, don't worry, just take it all. So he personally thanked the people who raised the money for it, or who contributed the money for it. And to me, that I hauled this stuff through the border, he found the time in the fighting to record a thank you note. And what he said was, he said, will now be warm, even though the cold is coming. And we promise not to let you down. And I was like, what? You promise not to let us down? You are, fighting and dying there. And that's how is this even possible to say something like that? He promised not to let us down. And there I am, strolling around Lviv and having my coffee and croissant. Oh, there's an air raid siren. All right, well, when there's no electricity, all right, well, there's a generator. But I think that was really kind of striking in the sense in which everyone is connected by this common purpose. And I also wondered whether when those soldiers will come back, whether maybe that will help them not to suffer that PTSD so badly, because they will return maybe to the society that has also pulled in whichever way towards this purpose, so they could relate, So that has been sort of my hope for this young man, at least, that he should
moving story.
Return home.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I mean, the book is powerful, but your own ability to communicate is really extraordinary. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to visit us. We're really honored that this is the first presentation regarding your book. I hope it becomes a bestseller. And we
I hope it becomes a stellar. Let's start at that.
We already have a couple of purchases in the room here. But thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back many, many times. So
Thank
please
you so much.
help me.